Thank you, Mr. Bremmer. Thank you for being with us today. So, seeing that we hosted as the Model UN Group, our first question was going to be a bit more about the United Nations. So, do you think the relevance of the UN will be the same in the next 50 years as it has been in the last 50 years? Or what are your opinions on the future of that?
Well, first of all, I want to say this is the lowest I've ever been in speaking at an event. I do feel like I'm actually looking up at the audience. I hope you guys are going to ask whatever the hell you want while I'm here. Make this as lively as possible, right? Because I'm usually pretty unplugged, especially involving students, right? So, and this is public, so do whatever you want with it. 50 years is a challenging time frame for anything. I'm not even convinced we have a good handle on what demographics in the world are going to look like in 50 years. You can do a much better job of predicting those generally than you can of that of a political organization. I mean, the one thing I can say is that bureaucracies and institutions tend to have a way of persisting even when they become irrelevant. Because you're talking about money and jobs, and those are important. People don't give them up easily. So I think to the extent that the United Nations has any say in it, they're going to try to ensure that they stay strong. But I mean, I would also tell you that when you start talking about more than 5 or 10 years, 50 years, I have to ask myself whether the principal unit of analysis and participation in the UN is what we're focusing on. Here I mean the state. Right? I mean, you know, the whole Westphalian concept, if you look at the broad sweep of history, is a relatively new and novel approach to the organization of human affairs. And over 50 years, it's not clear to me that big governments work very well. So I guess I would say that if you made me, first of all, most things that exist today as institutions probably won't be around in 50 years, right? I mean, most companies will probably not be around, or if they do, they'll be radically different. So generally speaking, if anything is going to happen with the UN, it's likely to be weaker, not stronger. And something else will emerge that will be much stronger at that point, because they just won't have the ability to be flexible the way that other organizations that emerge new out of whole cloth will. But if you ask me why it will be less effective, I would say one of the main reasons will be because that states as actors will have less significance on the global stage compared to other things, whether that be companies or sub-state actors like mayors in states, or super-empowered individuals like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Ma. I think that, or terrorist organizations, or anonymous, I mean, or loose constellations of individuals and other actors. And I think that all of those things imply that, you know, the United Nations could be stronger if they could adapt so that they could take advantage of a multi-stakeholder approach. But, you know, one thing that you learn about institutions is they tend to persist because they don't adapt. Right, because adapting is scary, so they'd rather hold on to the money they have, the support they have, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I would go with that.
Yeah. Just following up on that with regards to specific region-related questions. So we're ardent followers of your Facebook. Me and Arnav always discuss your Facebook posts, and in the recent ones, you 60 seconds thing that you do on your Facebook, you mentioned that the possibility of Turkish intervention in Syria is very low, a specific outright intervention. So with that, my question is on the possibility of Saudi intervention in Syria. So Saudi Arabia, as we see from Yemen, its military assault hasn't been effective, and the goal of overthrowing the Houthi government in Sana'a has failed so far. So what are your predictions? Do you think that Saudi Arabia will indeed intervene? Because in recent days, their foreign minister announced that they're sending some special forces to Turkey, and if that intervention takes place, do you think it will succeed against Daesh?
Look, I think one of the reasons why Secretary of State Kerry has now twice announced that we're heading towards an imminent cessation of hostilities is precisely because he is concerned that the escalation both within Syria and the potential for significant additional refugees to come crashing into Turkey and Europe has gone up, and also the potential for more countries to get involved militarily, which also creates unacceptable escalations, has gone up. I mean, look, this war is not new. This war has persisted for 5 years. We have over 5 million refugees. We have about 500,000 dead. So, I mean, why would Secretary of State Kerry suddenly really care about a ceasefire when he hasn't cared for 5 years. And it's precisely because the potential of this to get beyond Syria in a way that is considered unacceptable or dangerous has grown. And Saudi Arabia and Turkey are both a part of that geopolitically. So I do think that and the Russians are too, and I think the Russian willingness to talk about, okay, well, we'll define terrorists a little more narrowly, it'll be ISIS and al-Nusra, that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to see lots of violence in Syria, you will, but I think the hope on the part of the Americans and the Russians is that you do sufficient. You do a sufficient amount of work that you keep the Turks and the Saudis from going absolute apeshit. And that's a technical term. Look, I mean, the Saudis said that they were prepared to engage militarily. They put ground troops, but they also were very clear that they would only do that if the United States was prepared to. And as you know, the Americans are not prepared to. I would be very surprised, given how stretched the Saudis are, given that the Saudis have just come and said that they're not prepared to actually continue with military support they've been giving with Lebanon. $4 billion was committed, and then the Lebanese said, well, you weren't actually paying us the money you committed before anyway, so who cares? Look, with $30 oil, the Saudis should not be thinking about upping their international military interventions. The Turks, as I'm sure you know, are going to suffer probably a $10 billion hit. Actually, I'm not sure you know this. Who am I talking to? So, because of the Russian sanctions, tourism, trade, and all the rest. So, I mean, this is not going to be fun, and I think that, look, Syria is ground zero today for what I call the G0, the lack of global leadership and the creative destruction we're seeing in the geopolitical environment. So I do think these things are dangerous, but in the world in 60 seconds, I'm asked very quickly a question I haven't seen before, what I think, and the question was, will Turkey actually intervene militarily? And on balance, I would bet against that. But it's possible, right? I think it's unlikely. I think it's quite unlikely. It's possible. What?
Don't you think Turkey would have a different agenda to go into Syria?
Then what?
Because of the Kurdish conflict, Kurdish-Turkish conflict?
Yes, but it's a different agenda from the Americans, you mean?
Yeah.
Of course they would. I mean, you know, as I'm sure you know, the Turks have been very interested in having Assad removed. The Americans have said that we have such an interest, but that is not our actual policy. The Turks are incredibly concerned about the emergence of a separatist Kurdish force, which could become a state in northern Syria. They're also concerned about separatists within eastern Anatolia itself, and most of the Turkish military endeavors against the Syrians have overwhelmingly been targeting Kurds, I think over 90%. Now they have, since we've seen the ISIS bombs in Turkey, and there have been quite a few of them of late, and some have been quite large, the Turks are expanding what they consider their primary target set, but still the Kurds are the principal issue. But you know, everyone has a different preferred enemy in Syria. That's one of the reasons why it's such a mess. You know, you can talk to the Saudis, the Americans, the Turks. They all are fighting different people, and of course the Syrians themselves, who are most concerned about Assad, while the country that's doing the most to fight in Syria externally, the Russians, are most interested in propping Assad up. So the conditions to actually bring about a ceasefire, which is very different than a cessation of hostilities among a few of the warring combatants in Syria, those conditions are nowhere near close to being on the ground. We're not close, which means that you are very likely, as the weather gets warmer, to see a much larger round of refugees making their way out of Syria, aiming at Germany yet again. And given that the Austrians came out yesterday and said that they would be more than happy to allow 3,000 refugees a day to actually transit through Austria, but they would accept 80, those numbers are different. I mean, the Germans are under a lot of pressure here, right? This is not going to be a happy situation for them.
We're going to do questions afterwards, so.
Okay, so moving back to your Facebook page, so I'm just doing my business, stalking you on Facebook, and I see that you shared a quote saying, from the Wall Street Journal, saying that the central truth of Trumpism as a phenomenon is that the entire American working class has legitimate reasons to be angry at the ruling class. And you said the same thing about Sanderism. Can Trumpism or Sanderism be compared to any other phenomenon in recent history, as you've seen in other countries?
Sure. I mean, you can certainly compare it most obviously to what Piketty wrote about, Thomas Piketty, the economist in Capital, and talking about the hollowing out of the middle classes in Europe. Now, they're not middle classes, these are all rich people, but they feel like middle classes in the context of their own countries, which is their only, their only extant context. I mean, the fact that Piketty could even write about them as a middle class shows that his own worldview is incredibly narrow and just focused on Europe. Still a real point, though, and I mean, when you have the National Front in France polling at 24%, and when you have the Swedish Democrats, who are Swedish but are not democratic, polling at 20, where the Democrats are not Swedish but they are democratic, so you put them together, you get everything, right? Polling at 27%. These are real issues. But they're, while they are analogous in some ways, I don't think the Wall Street Journal got the entirety of Trump's appeal. And Trump's appeal is different from Sanders' appeal in a way that I think that what connects Trump and Sanders is this feeling that the establishment parties have largely benefited moneyed interests in the United States, that the political system has been captured by those moneyed interests, whether they're left or right, that the establishment parties are not very different in outcomes, and certainly not different in outcomes for the majority of American people. I mean, if you're living in New York, you could, hardly use a derisive term against a black person, but you have no problem talking about rednecks and flyover states. And so you do feel like the 1% and the privileged living in Manhattan, attending or teaching, God forbid, at NYU, are people that do not understand and are not interested in understanding that group, and it's not a small group. And I grew up in the projects, and I still feel that way, right? Because I think kick my ass if I wore this in the projects, or it wouldn't work. But beyond that, I think that Sandersism and Trumpism is very different. So, for example, I think that with Trump, it is a reality that increasingly millennial America looks and feels more like this room than it looks like Trump's supporters. It's younger. But no, it's much more multicultural. It's much more tolerant of gay rights and civil unions. It's much more willing to support the legalization of marijuana, as I suspect this room is. It's much. I don't know what you guys are doing now. You guys got the munchies right here. So it's much more. I mean, it is a group. It's much more secular. It's much less religious. And I think that there are a lot of white Americans over 40 that feel like this is a country that does not in any way reflect who they are. And I think that Trump is a piece of that. Trump really is allowing those people to articulate their grievances without a lot of holes barred. And it's real. I mean, the good news is that, eventually they're going to die. So the Trumpism is not the future in that regard. It may be the future from a class perspective, but it's not the future in terms of all of these, sort of more politics of identity things that are going on. And then you also have the social media piece, which Sanders is pretty good at, but Trump is awesome at. And 8 years ago, when the last time we had an election for a new president, social media didn't really exist in its form today. And today, you've got Trump with 6.2 million Twitter followers, and I think Cruz has a tenth of that. You tell me what that means. I think that means a lot. I think it means a lot. I mean, your question so far, I've talked about me on social. 3 years ago, you wouldn't have done that. And it's because that's the way you engage in real time with people. You can see me once a month on Charlie Rose. Great, but what about this morning? Well, out of sight, out of mind. Trump's engaging with those 6 million people every day, every hour. That really matters. And he's framing. He's framing it the way he wants it to be framed. That's new, too. And we're going to see a lot more of that. So it's complicated, right? Like so many things in the world. But that's what I was trying to get at. And I do think that the Wall Street Journal is, like so much of the establishment in the United States, are very conflicted because they do understand at some deep level that it's the dysfunctional politics that have been captured over the last half a century in the United States that have allowed for the emergence of forces that truly do undermine them. And the Occupy Wall Street moment was something that, you know, was very badly organized, and then it died. And once it died, it was like, oh, okay, we're done with that. And it turns out that, well, no, you beat it down, and now it's coming back up because you didn't address any of the problems, right? It wasn't urgent, so you didn't address the issues, yeah.
Okay, so as we progress through this election cycle, a number of issues have taken center stage. What do you think is one issue that has been underrepresented, political cleavage of this election that has been underrepresented and should be taking center stage but hasn't yet?
Well, one thing I've talked a lot about is the fact that the most important alliance in the world for the last 75 years has been the transatlantic alliance. That's true in terms of NATO, it's true in terms of the European relationship economically with the US, it's true from a soft culture, power, norms, and regime. So liberal democracy, you know, freedom of transit, human rights, that kind of thing. We're talking a lot about foreign policy in this election. No one's talking about the fact that the most important US relationship in the world is weaker now than it's been at any point since World War II. That is not on the agenda. I think that is a problem. And especially when you see the Brits tilting towards China, and the Germans tilting towards Turkey, and the French tilting towards Russia, you know, you realize that it's not because we don't like the Europeans, or they don't like us, because it's just kind of irrelevant. It's not on the agenda, so you just watch it slip away, right? I mean, it's kind of like a married couple who've been together for 60 years but don't talk to each other anymore, and that's not good, right? Especially because they spend more time together than we do with the Europeans, so, you know, at least there's a little bit of familiarity breeding contempt. We don't have that. So that's one issue. There are a lot of issues we're not talking about. That's one that's front of mind for me. Yeah.
I want to move into a little bit more specific question about not just right-wing movements, but right-wing governments, and ask a question about Israel. So we're actually hosting the ambassador of Israel to the UN at the end of March. Shameless self-promotion for everyone. But in regards to Israel, the question is about the paradigm of right-wing government that we've seen under Netanyahu for almost a decade now. So under Ehud Barak, who was probably the more liberal prime minister of Israel, in 1999/2000, we almost had a peace agreement between Arafat back then and the Barak government. But today it seems as if the peace agreement is far away from our stretch. Do you think that currently, with the way that Israeli politics has been working, specifically last election when actually there was a shift towards more competition and it wasn't that clear that the right-wing government would win the elections, do you think there's a shift away from right-wing politics in Israel? And do you anticipate, how would you anticipate the effect of that on the peace agreement with Palestinians?
I think that the opportunity for the peace agreement is gone. I mean, Tom Friedman notwithstanding. I think that, first of all, I've never understood the people that say that we almost had one before. I mean, it was almost signed. That's true. But, I mean, if they signed it, what would the likelihood have been that Hamas would have just lobbed a few more bombs, and then there would have been a cycle of Israeli violence, and then you would have broken apart? Or that Arafat would have been put under so much pressure, or he would have been assassinated, or his government would have been overthrown? I mean, all of these things are real, and they've broken up easier things to come to agreement on than the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So I'm not someone that believes that we were this close to resolving and creating a two-state solution. But, I mean, if you ask me about what's happening in Israel today, I believe that they have no interest in creating the compromise that would be required for a two-state solution. I think the Palestinians have no capability. And, look, Israel today, for the Palestinians, has become effectively a police state. The Palestinians cannot come to Israel as easily as they could before because the Israelis no longer need the labor. Hezbollah is not capable of launching missiles to kill or threaten Israeli citizens because of an American-provided Iron Dome missile defense, which keeps the Katyushas out. The Israelis are able, through some of the most impressive cyber capabilities in the world, to engage in near-complete surveillance, real-time on social and on purchasing and the rest, of those that are considered to be threats to the Israeli government that are living within Israel, or the Israeli people. And so, I mean, you know, what you have is a reality that even though the Palestinians are living in parlous economic conditions, their ability to even threaten a third intifada against Israel to try to gain leverage politically is virtually nil. They can use knives, they can use stones, or they can maybe, you know, sort of, you know, aim their cars against a couple of civilians. That's not, they can't organize, right? Never mind they can't get to better technology to be asymmetric in terms of attacks, they can't organize. Now, the real question is, number one, does that persist? And number two, is that a model for other countries? And here I'm thinking about refugee crisis, because if you are the Europeans and you are not prepared to shoot at civilians coming across your borders and really strengthen the borders, and if you do that, then of course you have hundreds of thousands that end up outside who are dying in a massive humanitarian crisis. So let's say they come in. But those numbers are going to be unintegrated in European societies and unwelcome, then suddenly a lot of governments are going to find the Palestinian solution that Israelis have found very attractive for dealing with their own populations that they consider to be dangerous. I think that is something we need to watch very carefully, because it does undermine, it really erodes the liberal fabric that Europe has lived under since the EU was created. I think that's a worry going forward. I don't know if you necessarily call that right-wing. I think it's populist and it's nationalist. It tends to be right-wing, but it needn't to be. It could be radical left-wing too. What it's not is centrist. That's pretty clear.
Okay, yeah, so you spoke about refugees, and you're back in the US. One of the major concerns...
Oh, because by the way, the left in Israel today is much less focused on the Palestinian issue than it is on social issues in Israel and the economy. So what I'm saying is, if you were to have this conversation today with the Israeli left, they'd be like, I don't want to focus on that, because it's not a vote getter for them. So that's why I'm saying I don't think it's necessarily as left and right as it would have been, like, you know, in the heyday of the peace process. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So one of the major concerns started with this refugee crisis is the idea of US domestic security, or domestic security of any country for that matter. So just in terms of US domestic policy and inflow of refugees from Syria and neighboring countries, how relevant are these concerns really legitimate? And if they are, what's the best way the US government can work around them to address these concerns when accepting refugees?
Of the United States?
Yeah, for the United States domestic security.
Well, look, I mean, one of the biggest rock star at Davos this year was Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and you know, he immediately said we're not going to be bombing in Syria anymore, but we are going to take 25,000 refugees immediately, which is about 22,000 more than the Americans have taken so far. That's Canada. Now, on the one hand, they've got fewer people. On the other hand, they got a lot of land, so you won't even notice them when the Syrians show up. As long as you distribute them geographically, you wouldn't know. So maybe that just resolves the entire problem. Just stick them all someplace in Canada. But you know, look, those of you that follow me know that my family on my mother's side, part Armenian, actually came from Aleppo. And so to watch the destruction of Aleppo that is happening today, and to see the American complete lack of interest, and in fact antipathy, and some of the strongest trolling that I'll get is when I talk about the fact that we need to do more to help these refugees, something I feel very personally about, and it's gone. I mean, it's just, there's no support or interest in the U.S. whatsoever. Now, I fully accept the fact that 1 million refugees coming into Germany, a country that does not do a good job historically of assimilating culturally distinct people, and Syrians, and not just, I mean, France, I mean, all of Europe. This is not a Germans. This is, I mean, France is also a huge problem. You've got, you know, sort of Muslims that are French citizens that are living in slums. Because in France, and Germany, and Denmark, and these countries, if you don't speak with the, you know, the right fluency and accent, and you look different, you won't be accepted as well in these countries. Where in the United States, you know, you speak with a Cuban accent. I mean, who cares? As long as you work on in, you know, Miami, you speak Spanish. So what? I mean, they completely run the economy in the place. It's fine. You know, so that there's no question that that 1 million of those people coming into Germany, a country that isn't really prepared to handle it, and a lot of them are young, disenfranchised men, you're going to see violence. And the 1,000 women-ish that were sexually assaulted in Cologne on New Year's Eve, and the German police did not handle it well, that is something that virtually no government would be expected to recover from easily. So, and there is no doubt in my mind that if the Americans were to accept a few 100,000 refugees, that we would have some incidents in this country. But I also think that if the Americans were to accept a few 100,000 refugees, and they were properly vetted, and they did not include, as the Canadians are doing, did not include single unattached men, which, you know, as a human rights issue, but nonetheless, hey, you know, you're going to have to make political concessions. The fact is that these people would do well. They would be given opportunities, they would integrate, they'd have the best possible chances in America they could in any other country in the world, and they would ultimately, and their kids would ultimately be a productive part of American society. And on balance, we find that first generation immigrants coming and work a hell of a lot harder than second and third generation, right? So you get a lot out of them. But the point, it doesn't really matter what I think on this issue, because the politics in America make it inconceivable that you could actually do that. But what it means is that we are no longer held up as a beacon or as an example of the way that other countries should behave. And you know, my first trip outside the United States of any significance was in 1986 when I went to the former Soviet Union. And what impressed me the most about this place that I had never been to before is that, you know, not that we were beating these guys into the ground economically or militarily, though clearly that was putting pressure on the government, but it was that young Russians and Armenians and Azeris and Georgians and Ukrainians looked to America as a place that was inspiring to them, that our values, that our support for human rights, our support for democracy, our support for immigration, our support for the free markets, this was a land of opportunity, and it was a great American melting pot, and it was a place that you wanted to get to. And they do not feel that way today. And a lot of people no longer believe that they know what America stands for, including Americans voting in the 2016 election. And as someone who grew up, you know, sort of in the 80s and in the 90s, when we won the Cold War, and we won it with these ideas, it saddens me deeply that this is something that we seem to have lost. And this election saddens me deeply for the same reason, that we're not talking about the things that make America great, and that's really too bad. Because what made America great? You want to make America great again? Immigration made America great. Isn't it strange that the thing that made America the greatest is the thing that Trump is least interested in actually promoting? And I find that truly sad. Especially because it's not that he necessarily believes that, but because he's just manipulating people who are on the wrong side of the stick right now. Is that a relevant question?
Yeah, don't you think that America is disinterested in the whole Syrian refugee issue because it's so far away from it, maybe?
You mean geographically?
Yeah.
Well, sure, of course. Yeah, okay.
Maybe a follow-up.
Is there, no, I'm not sure, I don't think that's a suitable answer to your question.
Shouldn't it be the problem of the countries that are close to it, like the border, the ones that borders?
If you feel that way, I mean, sure. There's no question that from a narrow national security perspective, this is not our problem. I mean, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you that American foreign policy is becoming more Chinese, right? It's becoming more unilateral. It's becoming much narrower. It's becoming a we don't care. Now, that's not what made America great. What made America great was after World War II, we actually created a world order and institutions that involved everybody, like the UN and the Bretton Woods Accord on Currency and the World Bank and the IMF. If what you're asking is, as you know, a younger person, hey, that was a long time ago, but why would we care about that now? I would say, I think you reflect increasingly the sensibility in this country, and that makes me sad.
I'm not saying it's my opinion.
I'm not saying that.
I'm an immigrant myself,
But it's a good question,
generation.
because I think most Americans feel that way.
Yeah.
Of course they do. I accept that I am saying that is the reality. Now, I am also saying that that means that Europe is going to fall apart. And not our problem, unless, of course, we like being tourists there. Or we want our trade to go as well. Or we want allies that are going to help us ensure the dollar is the world reserve currency and that there's one internet that everyone has free access to and that we care about liberal democracy, not just in our own country. Now, you can make those decisions because I also recognize that on a day-to-day basis, we don't care. I mean, I do, because what I do for a living, but it doesn't, but most people don't. Most people don't. And I am fully conscious of the fact that if you don't provide opportunities for a majority of Americans for the things they truly care about on a day-to-day basis, like, you know, their kids getting good education and them feeling like they can accomplish more, and then you ask them instead, hey, what about these Syrian refugees? Like, are you kidding me? You know, I mean, you're not going to fix our local bridge, and our roads are falling apart, and you know, and the police are coming after my neighbor, and you know, why do I care about Syrians? I don't think these are evil people. I think that there are reasons why, and there's so many reasons. I mean, one reason is that you get your news today from Fox or MSNBC, or you follow on your Twitter feed people that are like you and sound like you, and so as a consequence, you're not actually getting the perspective of, you know, people that historically would have been very different. And yet those are precisely the people, it's precisely the interaction of all those different sorts of people that made America such a great country. That'll go away. You won't see as much of that over forward. I view that long term as a negative, but it's not, I mean, this is a reasonable debate to have, right? Yeah.
We're going to move into Q&A shortly, so please keep your questions for the end. I want to move into, you mentioned the Soviet Union, so into the contemporary Russia and Vladimir Putin. So this man, as he calls his system, the vertical of power, right? Everything in the country comes down to one person's decision, the president of the country, and Putin, his system, the way he's been running it, has been pretty durable so far. But in your view, with the sharp drop in oil prices, for example, the Russian budget needs the oil price to be $52 per barrel to actually balance the budget. Right now, it's far from that number. How durable do you think is the Putin system, especially not if the upcoming parliamentary elections?
Yeah, that's very durable. His approval rates are in the 80s. They will probably stay there. The Russians are very happy that Putin has been able to make Obama appear his supplicant on several occasions. Certainly in terms of the Syria chemical weapons deal, certainly in terms of the focus on Syria, not Ukraine, certainly in terms of the cessation of hostilities agreement that Kerry thought he had, and then Obama had to call Putin. That plays really well in Russia. I think Putin's going to miss Obama. I really did. I think he will. You know, it's not just that. I mean, Russian reserves today are roughly what they were last year. They're financial reserves. They've basically been inflating their way. The ruble has dropped past the 80 to the dollar mark. That, of course, means that things are more expensive for the average Russian. Pensions are only marked, I think, to like a 3 or 4% increase. They'll have to go up somewhat, given the parliamentary elections are coming up. But, you know, the average, there have been some demonstrations, truckers, pensioners, but very economic, no political. There's no real opposition to speak of in Russia today. So I mean, look, Venezuela's in big trouble. They'll probably default by the end of the year. Nigeria's in reasonable trouble, and they may well have a currency crisis relatively soon. The Saudis are in big trouble, even though they have a lot of money, because, I mean, you know, the only thing that makes them legitimate is writing checks, and those checks are going to get smaller. The Russians really don't have a problem here. So of the major producers that really haven't diversified their economies away from energy, I would say the Russians are probably in the strongest position. Yeah.
Awesome.
So we've been real big fans of the 60 seconds. So we're going to think of doing something similar out here, but we couldn't fit all our questions in 60 seconds, so we're going to have 120 questions with me and Bremmer.
Okay.
So I'll get the timer out.
120 seconds of questions we've been
Okay.
Okay, so
I'll just get the timer out and we can
I'll begin, and we'll just keep alternating on our questions.
Fine, good.
Let's go. Ready, guys? Round of applause?
Okay. No applause? What's wrong with you?
Okay, first question.
Okay.
Let's
Ready,
go.
set, go. Do you think a transitional government will come into action in Syria? Transitional government in Syria.
No, I don't. Not in the near term. I think that we're stuck with Assad, and most of the country will be failed, and that's going to persist. Syria will never return to its previous position.
How likely is it for us to see a Brexit in Britain?
It's reasonably unlikely, despite Boris Johnson being now in favor of it, so he can become the next prime minister.
If there were to be a Brexit, who would suffer the most?
The Brits would suffer the most, but everyone involved would suffer. The economic hit would be significant for everybody involved.
Is the Arab Spring really dead?
Well, I mean, it never really started, so you can't really die from it.
Which country is most at risk of becoming a failed state in the near future?
I think Jordan is probably next in terms of not being able to handle the enormous refugee situation and the government being pretty brittle.
Okay. What would be the future of Obamacare, TPP, and the Iran deal under Republican government?
TPP will persist. It probably gets done in the lame duck. The Iran deal, is absolutely going to continue to be implemented, but U.S. sanctions will persist, which means that we can't, American companies will largely be disadvantaged compared to Europeans and emerging markets. And Obamacare is going to stay in place until you have a new Supreme Court justice, and then it may be relitigated. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. And final question, what would an expanded UN Security Council look like?
It won't happen because everybody has a veto, so it will look exactly like
Perfect, so perfect timing. Okay, now I'm going to open up the floor to question and answer, but I first want to give a chance to a few people who asked really good questions, but because of our timing, we can't ask them. So, Alexander Shapula.
Hey, Professor Bremmer, thank you for risking your ass getting kicked for wearing that jacket today. I think it's really cool. Despite what may have happened in the past. So, talking about China...
Those trousers would also not have made it. My neighbor, I just want to let you know that, yeah.
Yeah, I like to take risks, so... Yeah, so, so regarding China, talking about the government, kind of the Communist Party of China keeping its legitimacy, the economy is going to slow down for the past 20, 30 years. Economic growth has been like the source of legitimacy for the Communist Party. For them to kind of stay legitimate, what do you think is kind of be the biggest challenges to them going forward, besides the economy, maybe innovating or kind of militarizing?
I think the biggest challenge for them in the next 10 years will be how they maintain suitable levels of employment while a lot of what they do becomes more easily made efficient through automation. Right? I mean, think about it. I mean, they've got sort of baseline service sector, and they've got fairly advanced manufacturing sector, and those are things that are increasingly going to be hard to maintain a competitive edge as labor advantages go to companies that strip labor out, or productivity advantages. I have no idea how they get through that.
Do you think they can like innovate or like try to create some policies that like encourage entrepreneurship and kind of?
Of course,
like,
and they are doing that,
Yeah.
though their educational system doesn't facilitate it, but their willingness to abuse IP does facilitate it. So I mean, if they can keep stealing shit and they don't need to innovate, they don't need to innovate as much. And that's been a good strategy for them. And American companies find the market so attractive that they're willing to tolerate a certain level of, let's say, slippage in terms of American IP. But I don't think you can do, again, you can do, what you're asking is, can the Chinese continue to make a lot of money? The answer is yes. Can the Chinese continue to find meaningful employment for most of their population? I'm not so sure. And I'm not sure that the money that they'll make at the top level, given the level of both expectation as well as how many people you're talking about, will be suitable to maintain the present type of legitimacy of a single-party state. I'm just not sure.
Yeah. In terms of like, just one follow-up, like the education system, what do you think would have to change in China? Like inviting kind of maybe their students that go abroad to study at NYU back to the country, or?
Well, look, I mean, if I were the Americans, I'd be doing a lot more to get the Chinese over here, and then when they're here, I want to date them. You know? I mean, we need to marry the Chinese and keep them in America, and give them jobs, because ultimately soft power really matters. And I mean, the more you can have Chinese elites spending a serious amount of time in America and sharing ideas back with China, the more they're likely to integrate. And the fact that you have so many people here that then go right back, and that this is all they do is the 2 or 4 years they spend, is a real missed opportunity for both countries. So it needs to be more insidious than that. But when I think about what the Chinese need to do, they need to stop stovepiping. I mean, you know, in the United States, one of the amazing things is that, you know, different people with different levels of expertise from different fields work together all the time. Where in China, you become like this amazing scientist, but all you do is stay in touch with the people that are like have the same expertise, which is great in terms of like, why is there no Chinese Snowden? Because individuals in China working on their equivalent NSA are working on incredibly narrow things and not talking to anyone else. You know, in the NSA, things are connected. And so one person can have access to enormous stuff. So, you know, that's dangerous. But it also facilitates enormous entrepreneurialism, where in China, it really doesn't. So this is a huge structural failing of the Chinese system as they try to become more entrepreneurial in a world that's becoming more technologically sophisticated. I think that's going to hurt them, right? It really is.
Next question, Zarnab Adil. You can have the floor for question.
How do you view the role of Gulf countries as well as Saudi Arabia in solving the ISIS crisis? Do you think they've been fairly responsible in taking up refugees as well as dealing with the financial growth?
Well, I mean, they clearly haven't taken in refugees. I mean, they are providing some humanitarian aid. My problem with the Gulf states is that when times were good over the last 30 years and oil prices were mostly high and they had a lot of cash, that's precisely when you need to really find ways to bring women into the workplace. That's when you need to actually diversify the economy. 70% of all Saudis work for the state. That's just unacceptable. And you know, they needed, with their money, they need to do what Singapore did, right? I mean, Singapore was 30 years ago was nothing. And they did everything possible truly to become globalized. What the Saudis did, you know, they built a lot of cool stuff. But the Saudis themselves just did not develop a resilient set of institutions. They didn't develop a resilient economy, and now it's too late. And, you know, if you're a young Saudi man, you're not having fun right now in Saudi Arabia. It's hard to date.
As a young Qatari man having fun in Qatar.
No. No, it's the whole Gulf. I'm just using the Saudis as an example because they've got the 31 million people and because they're the biggest producers, and what happens to Saudi is going to affect the whole rest of the region. Now the Emirates have done a better job, right? No, I mean, look, at the end of the day, even though, first of all, the Emiratis let everyone in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, only about 12% of the Emirati population is Emirati.
Right.
But they're much more globalized, they're much more liberal. I mean, you can't gamble. But, you know, sort of, it's, aside from that, I mean, it kind of feels Vegas like I don't like it personally because I'm from Boston and my sensibilities are a little more, you know, buttoned down. But you know, they're building, they've got healthcare, they've got a financial sector, they've got massive transit hub, Qatar's been good at that. But they're just much more diversified, where in Saudi Arabia, the economy just kind of outside of, look, Saudi Aramco is one of the most technologically innovative, impressively managed firms I've ever seen in the world. But that's it. It's Saudi Aramco. You could be, and like, go to Kuwait. Oh my God. 3 o'clock, everyone just leaves, right? They stop working. I mean, it is like one of, and oil's like 93% of the GDP. They got nothing else. So what are they going to do? I don't know. Leave Kuwait. That's what I do. Get out. You know, where are you from, my friend?
Pakistan.
Pakistan? Okay, so you know how bad it is. Well, you could be from anywhere, right? But I mean, it's you've got different problems in Pakistan.
That leads us to an open Q&A, so if you have a question, raise your hand. And okay, how about we go with Kyle?
So yesterday, the U.S. government revealed that it actually rejected a chance for peace talks with North Korea to officially end the Korean War, but they ultimately rejected it because there was no possibility of discussing denuclearization. So do you think that was a wise move, or do you think a peace talk and a potential peace treaty would have been a road to denuclearization in North Korea?
Well, I think it is hard for the Obama administration to be seen as giving away the store yet again, even if it was the right policy. Because they've been sort of demonized by allies on this issue, right? On Syria, on Russia, Ukraine, on a bunch of stuff. But I mean, I will tell you, I speak with Chinese officials all the time, and this is their issue. They're like, look, you want us to pressure the North Koreans, but there's no carrot. The carrot is you've got to end the official war. Like, you've got to say you're not threatening them. It's not like the Americans are planning to invade North Korea. And you know, now that they have nukes, it strikes me as a fairly bad idea. I mean, even North Korean artillery, before they had nukes, conventional artillery can hit Seoul. And there was nothing the Americans could have done to prevent Seoul from being completely decimated. You're talking about like a minimum hundreds of thousands of casualties within 24 hours, right? I mean, the North Koreans they're fairly militarized country, right? So at some point you need to find a way to back off this state of perpetual war. And you need to find a way to recognize that our policy of saying it is unacceptable for North Korea to develop nukes has failed. Now, the US, you may remember, had sanctions on India and Pakistan because you're representing Pakistan now. Because they developed nukes against the non-proliferation treaty, and eventually the U.S. removed the sanctions. They've still got nukes, but they basically said, well, policy failed, and that was a long time ago. So I mean, America is capable sometimes of admitting failure. But you know, we got this problem. Like you got the Apollo 13 mission, and we have like this country that believes that like, you know, we can always fix everything. And we need to be a country that's more capable of like actually embracing failure when it's obvious, so that we can move on. Like we shouldn't wallow in failure. But narcissism is not helpful, right? Like thinking that like you can still win when like you actually lost years ago. Like you can't actually move on from there. What? Afghanistan? What did you say, Afghanistan? Yeah, it's all over this region, I can tell, yeah. So, yeah, Afghanistan would be a good one. Iraq would be okay, right? I mean, Vietnam, we moved past Vietnam, right? I mean, we lost that one, but now we're doing business with them. Now they're friends, right? What?
Cuban embargo?
Cuban embargo, 50 years, right? Can't be wrong. But I mean, when I said this on Charlie Rose, I loved saying this the other day, where I still know, like, you know, we could not get rid of the Cuban government with 50 years of sanctions. You give us 5 years of Starbucks, we will destroy this government. They cannot stand up to the venti. They can't do it. They want American stuff. They want it. And when you sanction these people, they don't get American stuff. But when you let the Cubans in, and every Cuban American wants to make money in Cuba, the government can't stand up to that. So, I mean, you know, you can turn a loss into a win sometimes. Right? But you have to be willing to suck it up. You have to be willing to say, you know what, that previous administration, they screwed up. Right? That thing I was saying last week, that was actually wrong. And how many political leaders are willing to do that? Particularly Americans or French or Chinese, those that really embrace exceptionalism. Those leaders that really believe that our values are fundamentally always right and better than other people's. Like if the Canadians and the Bhutanese were actually running the world, we would not have this problem. Right? Because they're small countries, they're much more willing to say, you know what, that thing we said last week, we were just wrong. That's not going to work. Sorry. Right? Like, look at Justin Trudeau. I mean, seriously, that is a country that's just gone on a complete 180. Everything they wanted, Keystone, you know, refugees, we were wrong. Russia, Ukraine, yeah, we got a lot of Ukrainians, but we need to work with Russia now. Awesome. Right? That's just fun stuff, the Canadians right now. Anyway, next.
Let's go with you right there. Just say your name and...
Hello, my name is Anna Sarabian. I'm from NYU Abu Dhabi. My question is about going back to the Syrian refugee crisis. There are several countries in Central Asia that offer to host their refugees, provide them with everything needed, such as Kazakhstan. And do you think it is possible to somehow leverage from this opportunity? And if so, how?
Leverage for who?
For the refugees to, for example, in Jordan, 5 million refugees. Is it possible to leverage from the countries that do offer, like they open their country to the refugees?
I think the numbers we're talking about here are small. I think the answer is no. I think this year we're talking about, you know, could be easily more than another million. And the Turks are housing 2.6 million. The Jordanians, I think this is well beyond, you know, sort of Kazakhstan fixing this. I mean, you know, it's just, again, a country that can definitely do something. But no one's going to stand up the way the Germans stood up last year. And everybody else is closing down. So we are not at the tipping point here, unfortunately.
Next question, let's go with you.
My name is Andres, and so in Latin America, we've lately seen a shift away from the pink tide movements, and along with that, we've seen the economic troubles that Venezuela has had, along with the political crises that continue it to this day. And now the threat of default actually comes in, which is almost guaranteed that it'll happen, given its terrible economic conditions. So what do you think the whole mess diving into, and how will the different coalitions and polarization affect this default process?
Look, I mean, it's going to be, so I mean, they're trying to move a recall movement right now against Maduro. It's hard to imagine it gets done in this year. Precisely because the government has lots of abilities to delay. Right, lots of mechanisms, lots of control, lots of sort of extra and somewhat extra legal and somewhat legal mechanisms they can use. Which means that the way Venezuela ultimately falls apart, you know, they default, you know, they're already cutting back on imports. You probably saw last week they devalued somewhat, they simplified the currency so that, you know, you can't use the secondary rate for a lot of goods you used to be able to. They pumped gasoline prices to the point that you're actually paying for gasoline now in Venezuela. It used to be free. It used to be free until last week. Now it's actually, you gotta pay for it. People get really pissed off. And, I expect that default is coming in the next 6 months, maybe 9. October, November is when the big new payments are due. They probably can't make them. And they have very little else they can do. They can sell off a few more assets. They're done. They're basically done. At that point, you're probably going to see a lot of violence. And I suspect the military will step in and force Maduro out. And there'll be a transition within Chavismo, but the new government will have to, basically put a completely different economic program in place. They won't have much time to do that. So that's where I think we're going.
Next question, let's go with you.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I had a question kind of about Saudi Arabia and United States relations in regards to, Washington knows that Saudi Arabia's continued to produce oil despite the price going down, sort of to hurt U.S. shale producers. And the United States also just made a deal with Saudi Arabia's biggest enemy, Iran. So how does this put a strain on U.S.-Saudi Arabia relations, and how would you advise a client who has business with these two countries moving forward?
Well, I was with Prince Turki last week, and he asked me, he said, so why are the Americans, why are you pivoting away from Saudi Arabia? Why are you pivoting towards Iran? And I said, we're not pivoting towards Iran, we're pivoting away from you. Those are different things. No, because the sanctions are still in place against the Iranians. Many of the American sanctions through Congress because of support for Hezbollah and terrorism, its ballistic missile developments and technology. I mean, the U.S.-Iran relationship is hardly close. It'll get a little better after these parliamentary elections, I expect. But it's not close. But the Saudis don't have a choice. I mean, the Saudis are producing at pretty high levels. The Russians are producing maximum levels. But if the Saudis reduce their production, they're the only ones that are going to do it. So prices will go up a little. If they get up much past 40, 45, then all the frackers come right back online. They can snap back immediately. I mean, if I were advising the Saudis right now, I'm not sure how reducing production is going to help you. I mean, if you could get a bunch of other countries to do it too, sure, but you can't. Now, the American-Iranian nuclear deal, which other countries did too, but the Americans got it done, that really hurt Saudi Arabia. We didn't care if it hurt Saudi Arabia. And when the Saudis decided to lop the head off of the Shia cleric, they did it a week and a half before implementation of Iranian nuclear deal. They didn't care that the timing was bad for the Americans. So, look, I think that it is high time for the Americans and the Saudis to be somewhat honest with each other that, in the Venn diagram of our interests, our common interests, the circles no longer overlap the way they used to, and that's okay. They overlap still somewhat. I mean, there's still lots of security interests. We have a lot of American defense companies that are selling a lot of stuff to the Saudis, and they still have a lot of influence in Washington. Obviously the Saudis are still interested in a level of stability in many of these countries that the Americans are too. But, what the Americans need from the Saudis, and here's where I think the Americans are making a big mistake. I mean, we have, sort of the Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, saying we need more Saudi support militarily to blow up ISIS. Not true. What we need is for the Saudis to actually create alternatives for their young men. It's like the drug war. We've been fighting the drug war for many decades. And we talk about going after these Afghan producers. We talk about going after the drug cartels in Mexico, closing the border, hitting the drug dealers. It's not really working because we want drugs and we got money, right? So we're going to have drugs. And I mean, thank God the Afghans have finally figured out that they can produce drugs again, because I mean, if 75% of their government budget comes from aid, which isn't going to be provided by anyone anymore, they better produce drugs, because otherwise they're going to starve, right? I mean, we're going to get drugs either way, but one way the Afghans will have no money, and the other way they'll eat. So if I were advising the Afghan government, I'd be like, poppies are the way to go, right? Because we need to provide alternatives for these people. I mean, at least then they have some leverage, right? I mean, right before they had no leverage. So, I mean, the same thing with the Saudis. I mean, you gotta work on the fact that the Saudis are going to be producing a lot more terror going forward. And it's not because they want to produce terror, but their model gives you no choice. And I worry about this immensely. We just do not have many strong Muslim leaders in the world that are talking about alternative models. We need Najib and Erdogan and Sisi and Joko and others to be actively out there talking about what it means to run a Muslim country that finds extremism unacceptable. And they'll take steps against it. They'll root it out. I mean, right now we still see clerics, Wahhabist clerics, that are being tolerated in these countries that are saying things that are not just, destabilizing, but are actively anti-civilizational. And they're just being tolerated. They're being funded. That's just unacceptable. And we need to do something about that, right? And I do think that Obama's made a mistake in not being willing to talk more forcefully about extremist Islam. I mean, I understand that it's not PC to do that, but I mean, the fact is that extremist Islam, and particularly extremist Wahhabist Islam, is actually a part of this problem. Now, another part of the problem is the fact that you created a state system in a pre-Westphalian environment. And, I mean, now that the Americans no longer care as much, because it's far, and now that oil prices are really low, I suspect that they are going to revert to a pre-Westphalian environment, like Syria has. And, that's why when you asked me what's the next failed state, it wasn't hard for me to, I wasn't looking to Latin America, right? Because, when Maduro goes, Venezuela will still be a country. But, you suddenly depose King Abdullah, Jordan's not a country. There's no way. Some of Jordan will be a country, some it won't be. That's what's going to happen.
I actually want to jump in and give a quick follow-up question to that. What are your views on the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman? He's a 29-year-old Minister of Defense, Minister of Economy, and at the same time Chairman of Saudi Aramco. He also gave a huge interview to The Economist, I think it was after the execution of Sheikh al-Niman. Do you think that he is truly a visionary leader who can change things in Saudi Arabia, or is it just a cosmetic kind of PR move that he did with recent changes?
I think he's 30 now.
Yeah, that's also true.
Just saying. I'll tell you something off the record. Off the record? You guys okay with off the record? Yeah, stop the camera.
Marcel, please. Marcel, please.
Oh, I love the way he says it.
Speaking of very nice, I think it's nice. It's the first guest who actually complimented me, so I feel like that. Right, so, and we always ask our guests questions that are kind of more sentimental in a way, and we expect brief answers. So if you're fine with it, we're going to ask quick questions. So first question, your role model.
That's so hard. I'm gonna go with the King of Bhutan, because when he took over and his father abdicated to him when he's still alive, and for the first year before he took over, he actually did a walking tour of the entire country and met about a third of them individually. And I've never been to a country where the leader is so revered as he was, and he also did political science briefly at the Kennedy School when he was younger, and is a fan of the J curve. So how can I not consider him a role model? I think that I'm giving it to him. Yeah.
Your favorite book and why?
The Art of the Deal. Screwing with you. I would say it's historically it would have been probably like Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll or Flatland by Edward Abbott, and these guys that like really forced you to like do paradigm shift by telling a story, make you think about how to think. More recently, I loved Super Sad True Love Story by Steingart. If you guys haven't read that, it's near dystopian, but it's lyrical, it's beautifully written, it really brings you in, and it talks about how in 5 or 10 years' time, how the world could get just a little edgy. But also is about relationships, and what I loved about the book is, despite the fact that it has this fascinating sociological and philosophical political science undertones, it also doesn't forget the fact that no matter how difficult the world gets, what really brings us together are the people that we engage with. And I gotta say, I always enjoyed and it's a weird thing for me to say, I liked the Gulag series by Solzhenitsyn. Because despite the fact that it was like dense and horrifying and so and just it's such a shoulderful, right, to put your back into, it also showed how important those individual relationships were, and the Russians are always been good at writing that kind of thing. So those are and it's interesting. I never thought of this before. It might be that one of the reasons I find Steingart so attractive is because his own background and sensibilities come from some of those Russian classicists.
The most interesting client that you've worked with at Eurasia Group?
Look, I love working with GE because they are, I mean, first of all, Jeff Immelt personally is, he's done more. He now, GE is one of the biggest industrial companies, maybe the biggest industrial company in Europe, bigger than the European country companies. He's actually managed to pull off a deal in France, which nobody does. Right? and it's because he's hugely strategic, and he desperately wants to know things that he doesn't yet know. He wants smart people to challenge him. It is, it's so different from the old Jack Welch GE, and he's managed to update a 20th century model and make it a 21st century company. There are not many people that have done that. Most of the old manufacturing firms, you kind of see the writing on the wall and see how they're going to fall apart. With GE, you actually see how they're remaking themselves every day. It's kind of fun to have those conversations. Yeah.
And final question, since our audience today is...
That's not very sentimental, but...
since the majority of our audience today are students, what is one advice you'd like to give us, the students?
I mean, I think it's to be as open as possible to ideas that challenge you, right? I mean, the reason you don't learn from the number of times I will meet someone who attended an event or a speech or whatnot. I'll be at a conference and say, that one was awesome. I'm like, oh, what did you learn from it? And they're like, oh, well, I didn't really learn anything, but it was really interesting. Like, if you're not reading things where you're really learning, where your views are being challenged, if you're not traveling places where your sense of culture is turned upside down, if you're not actually, sort of engaging with people that are challenging you, and that means not just the courses you're taking, but most importantly, your friendships, your relationships. I mean, the number of hedge fund billionaires that I meet who end up marrying like a 25-year-old trophy wife who's like supermodel, but they don't learn anything from, what the fuck is that? I mean, that is like, you get to the point that you're a billionaire and you could actually pick anybody and you choose not to find someone who's going to make you a better person. What is wrong with you? Like, that's right? That's the red pants over here. Yeah, I'm all over that. So that's what you and you got. If you guys aren't doing that in your relationships, your friendships, and your love relationships, if you're not finding people that are going to challenge your way of thinking, you're never going to do it. You got to start off now, right? So just try it. And go on a date. Who cares, right? Just whatever. Go hang out with something else. Just do it and throw yourselves in stuff that you otherwise wouldn't do. And spend a summer being completely doing stuff that you're not even sure you'll like. Very something like, oh, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. Just do it, as long as it's not dangerous, right? Just go. I think that's fantastic. With my first, I grew up in the projects. A professor of mine at Tulane got a scholarship. I was 15 years old. Was leading a trip to go to the former Soviet Union. I'd never been anywhere before. And I had no idea if I was going to like. I hated the food, and the bed was uncomfortable. And my first night, the Hotel Rossiya, which at the time has been torn down, I think, but first night I was there. It was the biggest hotel in the world at the time, and the lights were off, and there was the light was above the bed, and it was on it was on a headboard, and it was clamped to it, but the actual switch for the light was on the wire, the cord that was on the lamp behind the headboard. So I had to reach behind the headboard to turn the lamp on. So I put my hand back there, and I went to feel the cord, and it had been eaten through by who knows what. And so my finger went directly into the wires, and I electrocuted myself, and I passed out on the bed. And my roommate rushing in, well, what happened? What happened? I'm like, and I was like, I think I've been electrocuted. And it was awesome. I was like, this is wow. Because like, in the like here you get coddled and you can't, you know, your parents and your friends are like, you got to wear a seatbelt. It's hard to die in this country, right? The Soviet Union, people, you can die just from stupidity in the Soviet Union. And that, you need that. When you're younger, you need that. You need to have like the recognition that like, you know, that stupidity is not to be rewarded. And so just try that kind of stuff. That would be, I don't know if that's one piece of advice, but that's like a holistic piece of advice that I think basically puts everyone in good stead. So
I think I can speak from behalf of everyone who's attended our previous series. This was by far our most entertaining and best of. So please thank Ian by a round of applause.